The dust rose in thin columns from the hooves of the stranger's horse as he rode into the settlement they called Redemption Flats. It wasn't much of a town, just a scattering of weathered buildings, huddled together like frightened cattle in a storm, but it was the only civilization for 50 miles in any direction. The year was 1879, and the frontier was still wild enough to swallow people whole without a trace. The stranger was a tall man with eyes the color of storm clouds, and a face that looked like it had been carved from the same red rock that jutted up from the desert floor. His name was William Cord, though most people just called him Cord, and he'd been riding for 3 weeks, straight with only his horse and his demons for company. He'd come west to forget, like so many others, but the past had a way of following a man no matter how far he ran. He dismounted outside the saloon and tied his horse to the hitching post, his boots sending up small clouds of dust as they hit the ground. The sun was beginning its slow descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that seemed almost too beautiful for a place as harsh as this. He pushed through the swinging doors and stepped into the dim interior, where the smell of whiskey and tobacco hung thick in the air. The bartender was a heavy man with a beard that reached halfway down his chest. He looked up as Cord approached, his eyes making a quick assessment of the stranger before him. Cord ordered a whiskey and leaned against the bar, letting his gaze wander around the room. There were maybe a dozen men scattered at various tables, most of them looking like they'd been worn down by the land and the life, until there wasn't much left but sinew and stubbornness. That's when he first saw her. She was sitting in the corner, partially hidden by shadow, and at first glance she looked like just another child of the frontier, dirty and thin and unremarkable. But there was something about the way she sat, perfectly still and watching everything with eyes that seemed far too old for her small face, that made Cord pause. She couldn't have been more than 8 or 9 years old, with tangled blonde hair that hung past her shoulders and clothes that were little more than rags held together by dust and hope. Cord turned back to his drink, telling himself it wasn't his business. He'd learned long ago that getting involved in other people's troubles was the fastest way to find trouble of your own. But he couldn't shake the image of those eyes, ancient and knowing, trapped in a child's face. The bartender noticed where Cord had been looking and leaned in close, his voice dropping to just above a whisper. The girl's name was Sarah, or at least that's what people called her now. Nobody knew her real name or where she'd come from. She'd appeared in Redemption Flats about 3 years ago, just wandered into town one day like a ghost made flesh. She couldn't have been more than 5 or 6 at the time, already half-starved and unable or unwilling to speak. The town had tried to find out where she belonged, but she either wouldn't or couldn't tell them anything useful. No parents ever came looking. No relatives ever claimed her. She'd just become part of the landscape, like the rocks and the sagebrush. The bartender said she lived wherever people would let her, doing odd jobs for scraps of food, sleeping in barns or under porches. Some folks tried to take her in over the years, but it never lasted long. There was something about the girl that made people uncomfortable, the way she'd stare without blinking. The way she never cried no matter what happened to her. It was like she'd seen something that had hollowed her out from the inside, leaving nothing but a shell that moved and breathed but didn't quite live. Cord finished his whiskey and ordered another, trying to push the girl out of his mind. He had enough ghosts of his own without adopting someone else's. But as the evening wore on, and the saloon filled with more men coming in from the ranches and claims around the area, he found his eyes drifting back to that corner again and again. Sarah hadn't moved except to shrink further into the shadows as the noise and activity increased around her. A group of ranch hands came in, already drunk and looking for trouble. They were the kind of men the frontier seemed to produce in abundance, hard and mean and convinced that might made right. Their leader was a bull of a man named Decker, with hands like hams and a reputation for cruelty that extended to both animals and people. He spotted Sarah in her corner, and a cruel smile spread across his face. He walked over to her with his companions following behind like a pack of wolves. Cord watched as Decker reached down and grabbed Sarah by the arm, hauling her to her feet. The girl didn't struggle or cry out, just hung limply in his grasp with that same blank expression on her face. Decker laughed and said something Cord couldn't hear, and the other men laughed too. Then Decker shoved Sarah toward one of his friends, who caught her and shoved her to another, and suddenly they were playing a game. tossing the small girl between them like a rag doll. The other patrons in the saloon looked away, finding sudden interest in their drinks or their cards. The bartender wiped the same spot on the bar over and over, his jaw tight but his eyes carefully averted. Nobody was going to help her. In a place like this, you learn to mind your business and let the strong do what they wanted to the weak. Cord felt something old and familiar stir in his chest, something he'd tried to bury along with everything else he'd left behind. It was anger, pure and hot, mixed with something else he didn't want to name. He set down his glass with a sharp click that seemed to echo in the sudden quiet that had fallen over the room. Then he pushed away from the bar and walked toward Decker and his men. He didn't say anything at first, just stepped between them and caught Sarah as she was shoved in his direction. The girl weighed almost nothing, all bones and rags. He set her down gently behind him and turned to face Decker, his expression calm but his eyes as cold as a winter sky. Decker's smile faded into something uglier. He was used to people backing down from him, used to taking what he wanted without consequence. The fact that this stranger had dared to interfere was an insult that couldn't be ignored, especially not in front of his men and half the town. The words that followed were predictable, the kind of threats and posturing that men like Decker used to establish dominance. Cord listened without responding, waiting for Decker to finish his performance. When the big man finally ran out of words, Cord spoke for the first time, his voice quiet and level. He told Decker that the girl was leaving with him, and that Decker had two choices. He could let it happen, or he could try to stop it. The challenge hung in the air between them like smoke. Decker's face turned red and then purple with rage. He was bigger than Cord, outweighed him by 50 pounds at least, and he had 3 friends backing him up. But there was something in Cord's stance, in the way he held himself, that made Decker hesitate. It was the stillness of a man who'd killed before, and would do it again if necessary, without remorse or hesitation. The moment stretched out, taut as a rope under strain. Then Decker stepped back, just a fraction, and Cord knew he'd won. The big man tried to save face with more bluster, claiming he'd grown bored with the game anyway, that the girl wasn't worth the trouble. His friends laughed too loudly and too long, trying to pretend they hadn't just watched their leader back down from a stranger. Cord turned his back on them, which was either the bravest or the stupidest thing he could have done, and looked down at Sarah. She was staring up at him with those ancient eyes, and for the first time since he'd noticed her, there was something in her expression besides blank emptiness. It might have been surprise, or maybe just curiosity. He asked her if she wanted to come with him, and after a long moment, she nodded once. They left the saloon together, the small girl and the haunted man, walking out into the evening air that had grown cool with the setting of the sun. Cord's horse regarded them both with patient indifference, as Cord untied the reins and swung up into the saddle. Then he reached down and pulled Sarah up to sit in front of him. She was so light it was like lifting a shadow. As they rode out of Redemption Flats, Cord wondered what on earth he had just done. He had no business taking responsibility for a child, especially not this one, with her broken silence and her old soul. He didn't know where he was going, or what he would do when he got there. He only knew that he couldn't leave her behind, couldn't walk away and pretend he hadn't seen what he'd seen. They rode through the gathering darkness, the horses' hooves finding purchase on the rocky trail more by instinct than sight. Sarah sat perfectly still in front of him, not speaking, barely seeming to breathe. After an hour or so, Cord guided the horse off the trail and into a small canyon where a thin stream trickled between the rocks. He dismounted and helped Sarah down, then set about making camp for the night. He built a fire and cooked some beans and hardtack, the only food he had left in his saddlebags. Sarah ate mechanically, without appetite or pleasure, like someone who'd learned that eating was just something you did to continue existing. When she was done, Cord gave her his bedroll and told her to sleep. She curled up on the ground like a dog, so accustomed to sleeping rough that the simple comfort of a blanket seemed like an unimaginable luxury. Cord sat by the fire, watching the flames dance and listening to the night sounds of the desert. A coyote howled somewhere in the distance, lonely and wild. He thought about the life he'd left behind in Kansas, the farm and the family and the dreams that had all turned to ash and smoke. He'd had a daughter once about Sarah's age, with blonde hair and blue eyes and a laugh that could light up the darkest room. Her name had been Emma, and she'd died of fever 3 years ago, along with her mother. Cord had buried them both on a hill overlooking the farm, and then he'd walked away from everything and started riding west, trying to outrun the grief that chased him like a shadow. Now here he was, 3 years and 1,000 miles later, with another blonde girl sleeping by his fire, and he couldn't help but wonder if this was some kind of cosmic joke or perhaps a chance at redemption he didn't deserve. The next morning they rode north, Cord following some half-formed plan to head for the territories where land was still cheap, and a man could lose himself in the vastness of the frontier. Sarah rode in front of him, silent as always, but he could feel her gradually relaxing against him as the day wore on, her body losing some of its rigid tension. They stopped for water at a way station run by a leathery old woman who took one look at Sarah and made a clucking sound with her tongue. She brought out soap and a basin of water and insisted on washing the girl's face and hands while Cord tended to his horse. When Sarah emerged from the way station, her face was clean for the first time since Cord had met her, and he could see that she was actually pretty under all the dirt and grime, with delicate features and eyes that were the color of cornflowers. The old woman pressed a package of food into Cord's hands and refused to take any payment. She said she could see what he was trying to do, and that kindness had a way of finding its way back to those who showed it. Cord didn't have the heart to tell her that whatever grace there once was, it had stopped listening to him a long time ago. They traveled like this for days, then weeks, moving steadily north through country that grew gradually greener and less harsh. Cord found work here and there, ranch hand jobs that paid in cash or supplies, always moving on before anyone could ask too many questions about the silent girl who followed him like a shadow. He bought Sarah new clothes and shoes, and slowly, gradually, she began to look less like a half-starved ghost and more like a normal child. But she still didn't speak. Cord would talk to her in the evenings as they sat by their campfire, telling her stories about his life before, about Emma and the farm and the dreams he'd once had. He didn't know if she understood or if she even cared, but something compelled him to fill the silence between them with words. It was like he was trying to convince himself that he was still human, still capable of connection, by reaching out to this broken girl who might be beyond reaching. One night, after they'd been traveling together for almost 2 months, Cord woke to find Sarah sitting up in her bedroll, staring at him with wide eyes. At first he thought something was wrong, that maybe there was danger nearby, but then he realized she was crying. Silent tears were streaming down her face, glistening in the moonlight, and her whole body was shaking with suppressed sobs. He sat up and pulled her close, holding her while she cried without sound. 3 years of grief and fear and loneliness pouring out of her in a flood that seemed like it would never end. He didn't try to comfort her with empty words, just held her and let her break apart, knowing that sometimes that was the only way to start healing. When she finally stopped crying, she looked up at him and spoke for the first time since he'd met her. Her voice was hoarse from disuse, barely more than a whisper, but the words were clear enough. She said thank you. Just those 2 words, but they hit Cord like a physical blow, breaking something open inside him that he'd thought was sealed forever. After that night, Sarah began to slowly emerge from her shell. She didn't talk much at first, and when she did her voice was soft and hesitant, like she was afraid the words might shatter if she spoke them too loud. But gradually, piece by piece, she began to tell her story. She'd been traveling with her parents in a wagon train, heading west like so many others in search of a better life. Her father had been a farmer, her mother a school teacher, and they'd been full of hope and dreams for the future. But then came the sickness, the fever that swept through the wagon train like wildfire. Sarah's parents had both fallen ill, and in the chaos and panic that followed, somehow Sarah had gotten separated from them. She'd wandered away from the camp, delirious with her own fever, and by the time she recovered enough to find her way back, the wagon train was gone. She'd been alone in the wilderness for days before a passing trader found her and brought her to Redemption Flats. She'd been too young and too traumatized to remember her full name or where she'd come from. All she knew was that her parents were gone and she was alone, and so she'd stopped talking, stopped hoping, stopped being anything but a ghost moving through the world. Cord listened to her story and felt his heart breaking for her, for all the children like her who got lost in the vastness of the frontier and forgot what it was like to belong to someone. He made a decision then. Sitting by the fire with Sarah curled up beside him, he would give her a home. He would teach her to live again, to laugh again, to trust that the world could be kind as well as cruel. They settled in a small valley in Montana Territory, where Cord found work on a ranch and saved enough money to buy a piece of land of his own. It wasn't much, just 160 acres of grassland with a stream running through it, but it was enough to start over. He built a cabin with his own hands, working from dawn to dusk while Sarah helped in whatever ways she could, fetching water and gathering wood and slowly learning to smile again. The rancher who'd employed Cord had a wife who took an interest in Sarah, teaching her to read and write, and do all the things a proper young lady should know. Sarah soaked it all up like dry earth soaking up rain, hungry for knowledge and connection after years of deprivation. She was smart, smarter than Cord had realized, with a quick mind and a memory that forgot nothing. As the months passed and turned into years, Sarah blossomed into a remarkable young woman. The silence and the fear gradually faded, replaced by laughter and curiosity and a fierce determination to never be helpless again. She learned to ride and shoot and work cattle alongside Cord, becoming as capable as any man on the frontier. But she also learned gentler things, like how to tend a garden and cook a proper meal, and sing the old songs that her mother had taught her when she was very small. Cord watched her grow and felt something he hadn't felt in years, a sense of purpose and belonging that had nothing to do with running away and everything to do with moving forward. She called him Pi now, tentatively at first and then with growing confidence, and he called her daughter, meaning it with every fiber of his being. She wasn't Emma, could never replace Emma, but she was herself, precious and irreplaceable in her own right. The nightmares still came sometimes for both of them. Cord would wake in the darkness, hearing Emma's voice calling for him, and find Sarah sitting by the window, staring out at the night and remembering things she could never fully forget. On those nights they would sit together in the kitchen, drinking coffee and talking quietly about the past and the future and all the ways that life could break you and make you stronger at the same time. Word eventually came that a wagon train had been attacked by fever near Redemption Flats 6 years ago, and that several people had died, including a couple named Thompson. Sarah wept when she heard her real name spoken aloud for the first time in years, Sarah Ann Thompson, and she wept for the parents she barely remembered but had never stopped loving. Cord held her while she cried and told her that they would ride out to Redemption Flats and put up a marker for her parents so that they would be remembered and honored as they deserved. They made the journey south together, Cord and Sarah, riding through country that had once seemed harsh and unforgiving but now felt almost familiar. Redemption Flats had grown some in the years since Cord had first ridden in, but it was still recognizable, still the same dusty collection of buildings huddled against the desert wind. The bartender was still there, grayer and heavier but still wiping down the same bar. He recognized Cord immediately and stared in amazement at the confident young woman riding beside him, hardly able to believe she was the same hollow-eyed child who'd once haunted the corners of his saloon. They commissioned a marker for Sarah's parents and held a small ceremony at the edge of town, where Sarah said goodbye to the ghosts that had followed her for so long. She spoke about her mother's kindness and her father's strength, and she thanked them for giving her life, even though they hadn't been able to stay to see what she would become. Then she turned to Cord and took his hand, and she said that she'd been lost for 3 years, but now she was found, and that sometimes the greatest gifts come from the strangest places. As they rode back north toward home, Sarah talked about the future with an enthusiasm that would have been impossible to imagine just a few years earlier. She wanted to become a teacher like her mother had been, to help other children who were lost or alone or struggling to find their place in the world. She wanted to make something good out of all the pain and loss, to transform her suffering into something that could help others. Cord listened and felt a pride so fierce it was almost painful. This girl who'd been thrown away by fate and circumstance had not only survived, but had chosen to become someone who would spend her life making sure others didn't have to suffer as she had. She'd taken the worst thing that could happen to a child and turned it into a mission, a calling, a reason to wake up every morning and face the world with courage and compassion. The cabin came into view as they crested the last hill before home, smoke rising from the chimney where Cord had left a fire banked that morning. The sun was setting behind them, painting the valley in shades of gold and amber, and Sarah turned to look at Cord with eyes that still held shadows but also held hope and joy and love. She thanked him again, as she had that first night when she'd finally allowed herself to cry, but this time the words meant something different. She wasn't thanking him for rescuing her from Redemption Flats or for giving her food and shelter and safety. She was thanking him for seeing her when everyone else had looked away, for refusing to let her disappear into the shadows and become just another ghost haunting the frontier. She was thanking him for loving her when she couldn't love herself, for believing she was worth saving even when she'd given up on her own salvation. Cord told her that she'd saved him just as much as he'd saved her, maybe more. He told her that when he'd ridden into Redemption Flats, he'd been a dead man walking, hollowed out by grief and guilt and the weight of memories he couldn't escape. But she'd given him a reason to keep living, a purpose beyond just surviving another day. She'd reminded him that love didn't end with death, that the capacity to care for another human being could survive even the worst loss, and that sometimes the only way to heal your own wounds was to help heal someone else's. They rode down into the valley together as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky. The haunted man and the girl who'd been lost but now was found. Both of them finally home in a way that had nothing to do with geography and everything to do with the bonds they'd forged in fire and hardship and desperate hope. The frontier was still wild and harsh and unforgiving, but it was also a place where miracles could happen, where two broken people could find each other in the vastness and piece themselves back together into something stronger and better than they'd been before. It was a place where a stranger could stop and change a life with nothing more than the choice to see someone else's suffering and refuse to look away. Years later, when Sarah had indeed become a teacher and had started a school for orphaned and abandoned children in the valley, she would tell her students about the man who'd saved her life. She'd tell them that heroes didn't always come riding in on white horses with trumpets blaring and crowds cheering. Sometimes they came quiet and broken, carrying their own pain like a weight on their shoulders, and they saved you not because they were strong, but because they refused to let anyone else suffer the way they had suffered. She'd tell them that her father, the man who'd given her his name and his love and a second chance at life, had taught her that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the decision to do the right thing even when you were terrified. He taught her that redemption was always possible, that no one was beyond saving, and that the smallest act of kindness could echo through the years and change the world in ways you could never imagine. And on quiet evenings, when the work was done and the children were in bed and Sarah sat on the porch of the school she'd built, she'd look out at the stars and think about that day in Redemption Flats when a stranger had walked into a saloon and refused to let her be invisible anymore. She'd think about all the nights on the trail, the slow, painful process of learning to trust and hope and live again, and the moment when she'd finally called him Pi and seen his eyes fill with tears. She'd think about the wagon train and her parents and all the things she'd lost, but also about all the things she'd found. And she'd smile, because she knew that her story wasn't one of tragedy but of transformation, not about what had been taken from her, but about what she'd chosen to build from the ruins. She'd been lost for 3 years, wandering in darkness and silence, but then a stranger had stopped and everything had changed, and now she spent her days making sure that no child ever had to feel as lost and alone as she once had. The wind would whisper through the valley, carrying the scent of sage and grass, and all the wild, beautiful things that grew in this harsh country, and Sarah would close her eyes and feel at peace. She was home, she was loved, she was found, and somewhere she liked to think her parents were watching and smiling, glad that their daughter had survived and thrived and become someone who made the world a little bit brighter for her presence in it. The story of the girl and the stranger became a legend in those parts, told and retold around campfires and in parlors, changing and growing with each telling, but never losing its essential truth. It was a story about the power of one person to change another person's life, about the way that love could survive even the worst trauma, and about the quiet, everyday heroism of choosing to care when it would be so much easier to look away. Cord lived to see Sarah marry a good man who loved her and understood where she'd come from, and he lived to hold his granddaughter in his arms, a tiny perfect thing with blonde hair and blue eyes who reminded him of both Emma and Sarah and all the second chances he'd been given. When he finally died, peaceful in his sleep at an age far older than he'd ever expected to reach, Sarah buried him on the hill overlooking the valley. with a marker that read simply beloved father and friend, and she knew that his legacy would live on in every child she taught and every life she touched. The frontier eventually became civilized, the wild places tamed, the dangers diminished, but the lessons of that time and place endured. Sarah's school grew and prospered, sending out into the world generations of children who'd been given a second chance the way she had, and each of them carried forward the same message of hope and redemption that Cord had given to Sarah all those years ago in a dusty saloon in a town called Redemption Flats. Sometimes in the evening, when the light was fading and the world was quiet, Sarah would stand at the window and look out at the valley and remember. She'd remember the darkness and the fear, the 3 years of being lost and alone. But she'd also remember the moment when a stranger had stepped between her and her tormentors and changed everything. She'd remember learning to speak again, learning to trust again, learning that the world could be kind as well as cruel. And she'd whisper a quiet thank you, not to the heavens, but to the man who had become her father, who taught her that love was stronger than loss, and that hope could survive even in the darkest places. She'd thank him for stopping when everyone else had passed by, for seeing her when she had become invisible, for refusing to let her story end in that saloon. The girl who'd been lost was lost no longer, and in finding herself, she'd helped countless others find their way home too. It was a legacy built on one moment of courage, one decision to care, one stranger who'd stopped and changed everything. And in the end, that was what mattered most. Not the grand gestures or the dramatic rescues, but the small, quiet moments when one human being reached out to another and said in word or deed, "You are not alone, you are seen, you are loved, you matter." The Wild West was fading into memory, but the truth at the heart of Sarah's story would never fade, because it was a truth that transcended time and place and circumstance. It was the truth that we are all capable of being lost, and we are all capable of being found, and sometimes all it takes is one person who cares enough to stop and look and see the humanity in someone everyone else has forgotten. Sarah lived a long and full life, and when she finally joined Cord on that hill overlooking the valley, the school she'd founded carried on without her, staffed by former students who'd learned from her example and were determined to pass it forward to the next generation. The cycle continued, love begetting love, hope kindling hope, and the story of the girl and the stranger lived on as proof that miracles can happen in the most unexpected ways, in the most unlikely places, when ordinary people make the extraordinary choice to care.